We are ready.
Hi, everybody. This is Mark from City Church. So, the weather's been kind of up and down, so I haven't been able to ride my bike. So I decided that I wanted to take up hiking. So I had my hiking boots on. And so I created a playlist for myself, and I downloaded music from the Peanuts, from the Cranberries, from Eminem. I call it my trail mix.
Lord, my life is an empty cup. Here's my heart, would you fill me up? I'm face to the ground, forsaking my pride, leaving my will, my burdens behind. All I want, all I need is just to be with you, just to be with you. Here I am at your feet, just to be with you, just to be with you. I have come to the end of me, and there's nothing I have to bring. But you said I belong, you say I am yours. Nothing compares to knowing you more. All I want, all I need is just to be with you, just to be with you. Here I am at your feet, just to be with you, just to be with you. You made a way for me, oh Savior, I'm yours forevermore. You made a way for me, oh Savior, I'm yours forevermore. I'm yours forevermore. All I want, all I need is just to be with you, just to be with you. Here I am at your feet, just to be with you, just to be with you. All I want, all I need is just to be with you, just to be with you. Here I am at your feet, just to be with you, just to be with you. All I want, all I need is just to be with you, just to be with you. Here I am at your feet, just to be with you, just to be with you. All I want is just to be with you.
Good morning. If you've been around City Church for any period of time, you'll know that I am a big fan of Lord of the Rings. Even if you've just seen the films, as in my case, as the story unfolds, we're introduced to several different nations and all sorts of different kinds of creatures. We learn of hobbits, of wizards, of men, elves, dwarves, and how they all have their own problems and don't like each other that much all the time, developing all this sort of history over thousands of years. We learn of horrible creatures like orcs and goblins and urukai. Eventually, we see the grand plot of the story, and within that, we see all manner of subplots happening at the same time between these different creatures and different races. Grudges and grievances, alliances and fellowships. If you want to get lost in the subplots, just head over to a Lord of the Rings Wikipedia thing, a fandom, and you can read the backstory on pretty much every character you'll ever meet in the stories. You can learn about how orcs became orcs or where the elves and the wizards came from. The grand genre of Lord of the Rings is an epic narrative. Inside that narrative, there are even times for poetry and song and other kinds of literature. Of course, Lord of the Rings is fantasy. It does not pretend to be anything other than that. The Bible is also an epic narrative. It has all sorts of races, creatures, subplots, and many, many genres making up the 66 books that we have in our modern Bible. However, the Bible tells us that it is in fact the real story of God at work in our world, and particularly how he worked through the family he created called the people of Israel to bring our world to rights again. Now, if you've ever tried to read all the way through the Bible, you may have done really, really well for the first couple of books. You start in Genesis and then you read through Exodus and it's going really, really well. And then boom, you run into Leviticus and then Numbers and Deuteronomy. And it's like, what happened? Like all of a sudden, all I'm reading is a whole bunch of laws and these rules, and you're not really sure what to do with these things. So maybe you just skip that part and you sort of get back into the narrative with Joshua and Judges and Kings and go on from there. But at some point you start wondering, what's going on here? How is this all connected? We get lost in all the subplots and all the stuff that's going on there, or we just read each story like it's part of a series of moral tales. That all has to do with a misunderstanding of the Bible and why we should read it. Everything in Scripture is there for a reason. The authors weren't just throwing away space or telling us funny anecdotes about what happened to them when they went to draw water from the well. And Tim Mackey at the Bible Project, whom I'm indebted for a lot of my information in this series, describes the authors as literary ninjas. Nothing in Scripture is there accidentally. The Bible tells us a unified story composed of smaller stories within the greater narrative that leads to Jesus and has wisdom for the modern world. And keep in mind that just because something isn't discussed in Scripture does not mean that it conflicts with Scripture. So, what is this unified story? If you've ever heard someone try and give you the breakdown of the story of the Bible, it probably went something like this. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And that seems nice, and it's basically correct. But the first two items, you're done in the first few pages of the Bible. You're done with the creation, you're done with the fall. And then when does redemption happen? Jesus. So we sort of skip ahead and, we sort of find Jesus and, okay, there it is. But then we've got this whole section right in the middle that we don't really know what to do with. So what do we do with all this stuff in between? Well, we could read those Bible stories and look for life lessons, but those stories aren't meant to be taken as devotional learning moments necessarily. We could look at some of the biblical characters and try to act like them. But biblical characters are often horrible people, and if you acted like them, things would likely go very bad for you. We could skip it, but if you skip it, you would have chosen to ignore a very large portion of the story of what God is doing in and through his family and what he wants to do through humanity. The story starts with us being introduced to the author of all things. We read in Genesis 1, the very, very beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So God himself creates the universe and all that is in it. And then it gradually tells us the process that God had started of bringing order from disorder, order out of chaos. And we're told that what God created was very good. 7 times we're told God says it was very good. It was full of tremendous potential. And as part of creation, he creates humankind. And he puts his image on them, which means he gave man and woman the role of being his representatives on earth. It's not based on some attribute that you and I have or because of some cognitive ability that we possess. If that were true, then we would be denying the image of God in many people that suffer from severe mental or physical defect or the unborn. The image of God that we bear is given to all humanity as a status, as his representatives on earth. Human life is sacred for that very reason. They were to partner with God in expanding this area called Eden to the rest of the world. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." So God tells them, harness the potential and develop it even more. He wanted them to have lots of babies, have families, build communities, neighbors, be like him in continuing the creative process throughout the rest of the world. And in this Garden Eden, they were given a choice. 2 trees, tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They could choose to trust God's definition of good and evil, or they could seize the opportunity to define good and evil for themselves. They chose poorly. And sin results. Sin is the Hebrew word for failure. And they had failed to become what they were called to be. God is heartbroken. But even in the middle of that, he shows mercy. He says he will send somebody eventually that will crush evil at the source. Now somebody might say, hang on. Why did God even give them that choice in the first place? Couldn't he have simply made them choose to trust him? Sorry, it's not how it works. Free will is something that is given to us by God because it is essential in the business of representing him on earth. Without it, we could not truly represent him. A person cannot be creative without free will. And God wanted to share creation with his earthly family, the creatures he had made in his image. Now, Adam and Eve, they fell for a lie that sounded like it had a ring of truth to it. And there's a quest for wisdom here when you read the story. There's a lot more than just Eve getting duped by a shadowy presence. But that's for another time. If you're interested, Ezekiel describes his character in chapter 28 of his book from verse 12 to 19. You can go read that, and we'll maybe visit that some other time. But we see immediately into the garden, when Adam and Eve do this, we see immediately shame, distrust, and blame appear in the relationship between Adam and Eve, as well as between them and God. Adam blames God and Eve for what has happened, and they hide from God in shame. Adam and Eve, they're then expelled from the garden, which is effectively a temple that God had created to live in with his earthly family. You'll see references to this as you go through the Old Testament. So for generations, mankind is at war with itself, and death, evil, and curse prevail. They continue to define good and evil for themselves in their own way. But they come together and create a city named Babel. That's the name that you and I usually know it by, but it also means Babylon. You've heard that word too. Same thing. They decide that they are going to elevate themselves to become divine by building a tower to the heavens. Babylon becomes the image of everything that's wrong with the human race. God disperses them, and eventually he calls out of that dispersed people, that dispersed Babylon, a man named Abram, to go to a land that he will give him and where he will establish his people once again. He and his wife, they couldn't have any children of their own, and God chose them to initiate a new family for himself through them. God makes a covenant with Abram that he will bless the nations through his family. He renames him Abraham. And in doing so, in reestablishing this covenant with him, he is bonding himself to his family, and he weaves himself into their story in history. Is Abraham a good guy or a bad guy? Neither. He's human. He's deeply flawed. But what makes him a hero is that he chose to trust God. Apart from that, being like Abraham is not something you and I should generally aspire to. Much like almost every other Old Testament character, they are flawed human beings like you and me, who in the best cases realize the end of themselves and throw themselves on God's mercy and grace. At the start of Genesis, we see God bringing good and life, and we see humans bringing evil and death. At the end of the book, we see the same when Jacob, the father of Joseph and his 11 brothers, dies. His brothers have been waiting all this time, thinking that maybe Joseph wasn't over the betrayal that they had done to him. And they think that maybe once their father is dead, Joseph is finally going to have his vengeance. So they lie to Joseph about their father's last words. And Joseph says, guys, are you seriously still on this? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So at the end of Genesis, again, we have God bringing good and life, but man bringing evil and deception. It's a whole nation comes out of this people, this group of people living in exile in Egypt. God rescues them from the captivity that resulted hundreds of years later after Joseph. He makes a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and they agree to it. He asks them to be his representatives on earth. He wants them to be his priests, a go-between to the other nations, between him and the rest of the world. But again, these people just made the same choices as Adam and Eve and so many others. They choose to define good and evil for themselves. Back and forth they go in this cycle, generation after generation. God rose up a group of people called prophets. He used them to warn the people, to correct them, and call them back to himself. And God speaks to the people of Israel through these guys who tell them that God is going to send somebody to fix the problem that they apparently have with evil. And people don't listen until they're generally desperate, and then they only listen for a little while. You know, it seems so strange for us when we read some of the Old Testament. We see what incredible things that God has done for this group of people at one point, and then what seems like 2 weeks later are whining and complaining and doing stupid all over again. Now, a word to the wise. Most of the time, the author is telling us about how Israel behaved like that. They are holding up a mirror to the reader. They were showing how inadequate the people are in their own wisdom, their desire to define good and evil for themselves, and their refusal to trust God to do what he said he would do. So remember, this is not to show how ridiculous Israel is so that you and I can feel superior. If you feel that way, look out, because the author is probably about to lower the boom on you. The Israelites, God's earthly family that he'd raised up out of the dispersal of Babylon, and had been carried off into exile to Babylon when they refused to trust in the wisdom of God. They chose to define good and evil for themselves and end up in the place where people define good and evil for themselves. On it goes through the Old Testament. And while Israel is still waiting for the person who's going to put things right again, the writings of the Old Testament end. The prophets disappear. And the nation appears to be left hanging. But then this man arrives on the scene who comes from the line of Israel's kings, and his name is Jesus. He tells this nation that he is the one they have been waiting for. In the desert, he faces down the shadowy voice that his ancestors had given into. But he does not fail. He tells Israel that God has arrived to rule the world through himself. But, like the prophets before him, the nation by and large does not listen. The nation rebels against God again, like Adam and Eve and so many previous generations of Israel. And they have him executed. But in his being executed, he takes upon himself all the evil that humans could not overcome by themselves to deal with the consequences for them, for us, for you, for me. Now, because of that, all people have a choice again. They have a new tree to choose or reject. The cross that Jesus was crucified on is that tree. People can choose life and good in trusting God's work on the cross. Or they can choose to define good and evil for themselves and trust in their own wisdom. Those who choose to trust in the wisdom of God can know that they are loved and forgiven, and then can, in turn, love and forgive others. Jesus became what we are so we could become what he is. Jesus forms a new covenant people. He deputizes his disciples, who then guide his people through their writings that become the New Testament. And the apostles saw themselves as continuing this tradition of the prophets in the Old Testament, encouraging, correcting, and calling the new Jesus communities to stay focused on Jesus and what he means for the world. Now, the Bible ends by pointing to the future day when all is made right once more, and they will reign forever and ever. It all starts with God creating his earthly family in the Garden of Eden. And after all the ups and downs of humanity refusing to trust in God's wisdom, choosing our own instead, defining good and evil for ourselves, he has made a way for us to become what he created us to be. And then the Bible ends with the recreation of Eden, where those who trust will reign forever and ever with him. That's the story the Bible tells in an incredibly, incredibly small nutshell. Just a few comments to finish. The Bible is not a divine rule book. It is not a personal devotional. It is not a theological encyclopedia. The Bible is supposed to change, transform our behavior. The Bible is speaking a personal divine word to every one of God's people. The Bible is shaping what we believe at a fundamental level of who we are and what that means for us and for the world. But the Bible is born out of history, out of the covenant story that leads to Jesus and his formation of a new covenant people. Some people read the Bible and come away convinced that it is purely a human book because of how the author's personality, technique, and style come through. And then some people are afraid that if we acknowledge the human side of this incredible work that we call the Bible, that it somehow tries to remove God from the picture. But neither is necessary. We have a creator God who wants to partner with humanity and whom he has deputized as his representatives on earth and proceeded to weave himself into the story of the family he raised out of Babylon and then continued working with throughout the nation's history, even when they failed him catastrophically. We have a creator who wanted us to partner with him in creativity in this world from the very, very beginning. The fact that there is a human side of Scripture makes what God has done and what he has given us in the form of the Bible even more incredible. It makes it possible for us to actually walk back in human history, to observe his people through a historical lens and actually get close to the origins of that book. Beware of books that simply drop from the sky telling you what to do, often revealed to a single individual. We have an absolutely unparalleled wealth of knowledge that can help us trust in Scripture in the form of the B-I-B-L-E. Next week, we will zoom in and begin to examine parts of the Bible more closely. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
Again. Hey everyone, we hope you enjoyed our video today. Before you go, would you smash that like button, hit subscribe, and even turn on the bell for notifications when we post videos like this and other content as well. Did you do it? Great! Now go check out Mosaic Kids.